Okay, so today basically I want to talk about, as you see here, the internalizing of a discourse of parental blame. Okay, so I want to talk about this discourse and the way in which it's internalized among a really very diverse group of research respondents. So this group includes community members of the two communities that Martin and myself conducted fieldwork in, representatives of state agencies, community workers, and also members of the Gardaí. And I suppose I want to talk about this in terms of making connections, making bigger connections between broad neoliberal ideologies that seek to apportion blame and responsibility in equal part. And very often this apportioning of blame and responsibility is being laid at the feet of people who are least well able, or who are positioned as being least well able to counter these accusations. And what happens in this instance, as we'll see here today, is that very often people end up absorbing and accepting both responsibility but also blame for their own circumstances. So that's kind of the main issue that I want to talk about. And this discourse came out as an unanticipated finding in our larger study. So some of you might be familiar with it. It's called Feeling Safe in Our Community. Martin and myself conducted the study 2 years ago now, probably, and you can read it in full in here, and we'll kind of draw some important findings out of it today. So this discourse of internalization of blame, it was unanticipated in our larger study, and it pointed us towards a really surprising willingness among people who are living in very challenging circumstances, but also those who are charged with providing services and providing support to them. And it pointed to a willingness to locate the origin of long-standing social problems, not with entrenched and ingrained long-term multi-generational economic and social inequalities, but with their own neighbours. So this is a really divisive, really problematic discourse, and we were quite surprised to see the strength with which it came out in people's discussion about their communities and about their neighbours. Okay? So what Martin and I have argued is that this discourse, this divisive discourse, does a number of things. It's, as we say, it's very divisive at a local level, but at a broader level, it's working to absolve the state of responsibility. So it's working to absolve the state of responsibility to vulnerable families. It helps to legitimise cutbacks. It helps to legitimise the withdrawal of social support. And it encourages uncritical and very individualised discussion of what are very complex collective responsibilities. It relies primarily, as we said, on the apportioning of what Lawson and Kearns in 2010 have termed responsibilisation. And basically, Lawson and Kearns discuss this in terms of the role of the community in regeneration. Primarily, that is their focus. And they see it as an example of, sorry, I just realised I forgot to move the slide. Yeah, there we go, sorry. They see it as an example of the state pushing responsibilities onto communities that are often very vulnerable. And there's an expectation with this notion of responsibilisation, there's an expectation that it is vulnerable communities who are expected to take control of their own circumstances and who are expected to take control of their own surroundings. And this raises a really important question. Why is it always only poor communities who are expected to take responsibility and to police their own areas? Do we have the same expectations about people living in middle-class areas, or when trouble occurs, are they simply expected to call the authorities and have it dealt with? Okay? So this forced transfer of responsibilities is very problematic because it does seek to leave the state off the hook in terms of addressing inequalities. It can also be a strategy to further absolve the state by utilising neoliberal constructs of individual responsibility. And very basically, all that means is that it's recasting people who are living in poverty as being responsible for their own marginalised positions. So we start to have discourses in and around communities that are in trouble, communities that are in crisis, communities that are facing problems, that these communities are in this situation, are having these problems because the people living in them don't live there correctly, or the people living in them are not looking after their communities. So those are some of the two key issues, I suppose, that I want to raise today. The overall issue of responsibilisation and the internalising of a particular discourse of responsibility. So to begin, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the background, the location of the study. We'll have a brief insight into, I suppose, the contemporary Irish context of austerity and crisis. We probably don't need to talk about it too much because we're all living in it. So I think we probably hear enough about it. And we're going to link that then to the kind of overarching discourse of neoliberalism that dominates contemporary Irish political and economic life. I'll only speak very, very briefly about our methodological approach because we don't have a lot of time today, and then we'll focus on some discussion of the findings. So in terms then, firstly, of the background, obviously we don't have scope to discuss the full study. It can be read in this, I'm sure there's copies in the library and around the place, and some of you are probably familiar with it, but the study basically was commissioned by the Limerick Regeneration Agencies. It was co-funded by the Faculty of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences, and it was conducted here in the Department of Sociology at the University of Limerick. In very brief, the study set out to collect and to audit concerns relating to community safety in the two neighbourhoods of South Hill and Ballincurra Weston in Limerick. So we wanted to know, what are people concerned about? What are people afraid of? What fears do people have? What worries do people have about the communities that they are living in? So we ran a series of focus groups and also individual interviews, and we spoke to residents, we spoke to council and regeneration officials, to community workers, estate management, HSE people, the Gardaí and other stakeholders, other people who were engaged in the communities in some way. And we wanted to find out what all of these diverse groups were most concerned about in relation to community safety. And I suppose we wanted to see where there were crossovers, if there were crossovers. Did people across these different positions or these different areas, did they share the same concerns? Were people more fearful of certain aspects than others, and so on? And I suppose we wanted to be able to make recommendations at the end, make recommendations that would hopefully enhance the quality of life for residents in these areas. So in terms of location, the study was focused on two local authority estates, South Hill and Ballincurra Weston. Parts of these estates have very strong community ties and have very positive and high levels of social capital. But there are some parts of both South Hill and Ballincurra Weston where the UCC sociologist Niamh Hourigan has described where the disadvantaged of the disadvantaged live. Okay, and in these parts of these estates, basically, problems in and around community violence, vandalism, dereliction, boarded up houses and associated environmental decline, criminal activity, both high level and low level, petty crime and kind of low level intimidation and so on by children, by young people, are much more prevalent than others. So some parts of the community are experiencing quite high levels of fear, and quite high levels of fear associated with everyday life. And I suppose as kind of a side note, we're all familiar with the public portrayals of Limerick and the public portrayals of parts of Limerick, and media perspectives on Limerick as well play a very important role in these issues of creating fear and understanding fear. But basically, I suppose it's necessary to understand, I suppose, some of the specificities of both of these neighbourhoods, of Ballincurra Weston and of South Hill, and to understand a little bit about the local economic structure and the historical process of primarily of industrial restructuring that occurred in Limerick, and that we can kind of, I suppose, lay some of the beginnings of what we can call the residualisation of these estates. Okay, so the closure of the Crux factory in 1997 would be a major turning point. Okay, in terms of over 2,000 jobs were lost. Okay, so the effects of this industrial restructuring program has left Limerick in a situation where it is socially and spatially uneven. Okay, so you have in South Hill and Ballincurra Weston, you have exceptionally high unemployment rates, you have very high levels of unskilled and semi-skilled manual social classes, but you also have, very importantly, very high levels of children under 15 years of age and lone parent families, and the highest levels in the city. So there's specific situations in these estates. So I suppose this is some of the kind of the background context to the to the overall study. And in terms of, the different roles of the different agencies, okay, Limerick City Council, as we know, has responsibility for the management of public housing. Okay, so it has responsibility for the management of public housing in these estates. Excuse me. So it does have the power to evict tenants for antisocial behaviour. However, some residents in some parts of these estates have argued that some housing management decisions have made antisocial behaviour worse and have destabilised previously settled areas. So there's been incidences where ill-informed decisions have been made and families have been moved into parts of the estates where maybe they're not suitable for people with young children and so on. And there has been, I suppose, a reluctance on the part of Limerick City Council to really understand the situation on the ground and to think about where families are being moved and where older people are being moved, and to think, I suppose, about the whole context of where people are living and how they are living alongside each other. So some people have actually argued, some residents have argued that housing management decisions have made antisocial behaviour worse and have actually destabilised areas that were previously settled and that were previously quiet. So, sure, everybody is familiar with the origins of the Limerick Regeneration Programme. Okay, we can locate in and around the very upsetting arson attack on 2 little children in Moyross in September 2006. Following this, the government appointed John Fitzgerald, who's a former Dublin City manager, to carry out an investigation into the situation in the local authority estates in Limerick and to make recommendations directly to the Cabinet. So he produced what's known as the Fitzgerald Report. I'm sure everyone is very familiar with that. And some of the recommendations that were made in the Fitzgerald Report were acted upon and others weren't. Some of the one of the chief recommendations made was the increased involvement of the Criminal Assets Bureau, but also more practically for people's everyday lives, was recommended that there was a much more highly visible Garda presence in the estates. And arguably that hasn't happened. Okay, so that was one of the main recommendations, but we haven't really seen, or we didn't see much progress on that. So, progress in general on the regeneration of the estates has been, and I suppose continues to be, extremely slow. And the Chief Executive Officer, Brendan Kenny, is aware, the original Chief Executive Officer, been aware that progress has been made, but also, there is an awareness that the situation under regeneration has actually been made worse for some people. Okay, their living conditions have actually worsened. They're no better than they were, and in some cases, they are actually worse. So, Niamh Hourigan, again, the UCC sociologist, argues that community policing and the visibility, particularly of the Emergency Response Unit, which is the armed unit in Limerick, can be a hugely effective policy response, and it can represent a sense that things are being done, a frontline intervention, that people are being taken seriously and that specific problems are being targeted. Okay? And there have been reductions in crime rates, and we did see when we were speaking to residents in particular in the communities, we did see people did document quite positive relationships between themselves, and particularly the community Gardaí. So there has been some developments, in terms of relationships between the Gardaí and local communities, although there is, fairly high levels still of mistrust. But the relationship in particular with the community Gardaí seems to be, at that time was quite positive and was quite strong. So, while there has been some additional police resources deployed, and while there are some documenting or some reporting of positive experience, very largely across Weston and South Hill, there hasn't seen the full effects of these measures. There hasn't been a very positive development in terms of policing. And one of the major problems in relation to policing in these communities is the failure to address the antisocial or criminal behaviour of minors. Okay, so the antisocial, troublesome, difficult behaviour, particularly of children who are under the age of criminal responsibility. Okay, so that has been seen as one of the major problems, okay, or the major failures. And I suppose, the system does see the Gardaí as having a fairly limited ability to kind of officially tackle the behaviour of these children. They can pick them up and they can bring them home, but that really is the extent of what they can do. Okay? And the overall, the juvenile justice system, you know, it's not dealing with this issue adequately. And there's kind of confusion, I suppose, about, you know, where to lay this responsibility. Is it the responsibility of our young children who are causing trouble, who are causing problems in the community? Is it the responsibility of the health service executive? Do they have a duty of care towards children under the Children's Act? If they do, it's not being acted upon. And we know Limerick City Council, you know, can act, but only where people are in public housing. So they have no powers to intervene or to deal with problem families or problem children, as they're known, who are living in private rented accommodation or owner-occupied accommodation. Okay, so we have this is a major problem, the behaviour of young children, but also, you know, we have this overall context of austerity and poverty and cutbacks and reductions and just pullback of everything, of services, of clubs, of, you know, facilities. So we have this overall austerity agenda that successive governments have been pursuing since 2006, and, you know, this is seeing huge social difficulties being experienced. We have, you know, huge increases in unemployment, consecutive welfare cuts, and, you know, all of this adds up to ever reducing household incomes and ever increasing household problems. And what this means is that, you know, we're seeing the possibility and, you know, the playing out that the serious problems that are evident in these estates will probably become even more pronounced in the future. Okay, particularly as services for young people are cut back and services for young people are withdrawn. So, if we just talk briefly about neoliberalism for a moment, okay? We can understand it, you know, on the one hand, just as an economic policy program, or we can take a kind of, I suppose, a more holistic or more inclusive view of neoliberalism as a form of public pedagogy. And I think this is a really interesting way of looking at neoliberalism, because, you know, attempts by governments to keep rolling back, to further retrench the welfare state, this is a very difficult process. I mean, it's politically very difficult. You know, it's problematical for getting re-elected, which, as we know, is the chief concern of all of our politicians. So neoliberal governments have to work in a particular way in order to make this acceptable. Okay, so they've been engaging in what Gutstein calls manufacturing a new reality using an ambitious blame the victim bait and switch strategy. I think that's a really good way of looking at it. In order to make these cutbacks not attractive, but in order to make these cutbacks acceptable, this blame the victim strategy is being used to encourage a shift in how poverty and marginalisation are viewed. So we have a government suggesting, a government telling us that excessive resources are being used up or being exhausted by the poor through social welfare. They're costing us too much. There's too many poor people and they're too expensive. They're getting too much. So in this context, it is apparent that what we're seeing is a process of responsibilization is currently underway. And part of this process is the construction of an understanding that believes that it's people's own fault. People are poor because they don't have the drive to better themselves. These people are living in poor communities because they don't work hard enough. They don't want to work, so they won't get up off their butts and they won't go out and get jobs. It's this suggestion that it's people's own fault. So part of this process, you know, this neoliberal ideologies and myths are injected into public discourse where they're constructed as fact. And these myths work to stigmatise members of the working class as being undeserving of the assistance that they're receiving. And what this does is it completely disregards how people got there in the first place. It completely disregards the structural causes of economic and social difficulties, and therefore is working to absolve the state and the system of any responsibility. And obviously the media plays a highly significant role in this. It's reproducing, it's re-entrenching understandings of the more disadvantaged poor as being members of an underclass. And members of this underclass are characterised by a deficiency in morality. They're not good people, is the suggestion. So the media is offering us continually negative portrayals of those who are living at the margins of society, and it's offering very little, or if any, significant challenge to government mantras declaring that, you know, excessive resources, too much is being used up by the poor through social welfare, through rent allowance and so on. So the ability of the state to force through austerity measures, to cut back social funding, and to roll back on previous commitments depends then very much on the willingness of the wider community to believe that responsibility for long-term social and economic marginalisation and the problems that come with that, to believe that this rests not with the state but with bad and with undeserving citizens. And increasingly, as we found, it rests with bad parents. So, following this, or staying with this notion of an underclass, or the creation or the suggestion of an underclass, Levitas uses the term the moral underclass discourse. And what we see is that this has resulted in the demonization of the most disadvantaged in society. And this has become an endemic feature of contemporary political and also popular media discourse. Okay, we see television shows. We were talking about a reality show this morning, that works to initiate discourses of middle-class disgust directed at this so-called underclass. Okay? So it's become endemic, not just in our political language, but also in our popular media discourse, which often has more impact. More people engage with it, more people watch it, and it normalises it. You're seeing this on television all the time, people being spoken about in a particular way, people being portrayed in a particular way. It makes it normal, okay? It normalises it, and people accept, okay? So what this is doing is it's serving to reaffirm very long-held beliefs about the dangerous working classes, those who are perceived as being a threat to the moral and social order, and increasingly those who are seen as being non-contributors to prosperity, and as over-contributors to decline. So social problems, such as those that are experienced in South Hill and Ballinacurra Weston, were previously understood to result from social injustice, social inequality, the flaws that are an inherent part of capitalism. But now these issues are said to be a consequence of personal deficiencies, to arise from a culture of dependence, and very importantly, to come out of lifestyle choice, that people are choosing to live in this way, that it's their own fault, that they're making their own choices and they want to live this way. So why should they get anything? Why should they be deserving of anything? So basically, Jones tells us that the media, popular entertainment, and the political establishment have gone out of their way to convince us that these are moral issues, these social problems are actually moral issues, that it's about indiscipline that needs to be rectified. So the suggestion is that it's a lack of morality. Okay, it's a deficiency in morality among the poor, and the best way to rectify this, apparently, is to make people poorer. Okay, so we have an example in the study that in the UK, David Cameron has spoken about. What matters most to a child's life is not the wealth of their upbringing, but the warmth of their parenting. Okay, and on the surface that seems like a lovely thing to say. What a nice, cuddly, kind thing to say. But really, it says you're not getting any more money. Okay, so this ideology, it's about the abandonment of economic notions of inequality. We don't talk about class anymore in terms of social inequality, social injustice. Now we're talking about class in terms of, hardworking families and not hardworking families. Okay, so it's a shift in language, but a shift in language that is really, really important. So it's about the abandonment of economic notions of inequality and a move towards moral intervention, fixing people's morals, fixing the way people live, fixing people's lifestyle choices. And this is highly significant, because if public attitudes are being informed by such inaccurate, ideologically driven and stigmatizing representations of the poor, then the policies that are preferred by public elites, they're unlikely to seek to tackle the structural causes of the difficulties that the poor are experiencing. So where the general public, again, do not have first-hand experience of the difficulties and the problems associated with life at the margins, which the vast majority of people do not, they're more likely to accept the popular media and popular public view of deficient individuals squandering the opportunities that have been offered to them by the state. So I suppose a final point on this, I just mentioned it a moment ago, but just maybe to be very clear about the importance of the way in which the state has ceased to use the meaningful language of working class, okay, or middle class. As we say, we hear about hardworking families or children in poverty. And these two groups, children in poverty and hardworking families, these are groups who are presented as not being to blame for their situation. You can't blame a child for living in poverty. You can't blame a hardworking family for living in poverty, okay? But what happens is when you have a group who cannot be blamed, you have a deserving poor. And the minute you call into existence a deserving poor, you call into existence its opposite, its opposing number, the undeserving poor, those who can be blamed, the feckless, the unemployable, the lazy, those who do not have the personal drive or the moral fibre to better their own circumstances. So, I suppose, I just will say very, very, very quickly about our methods. Basically, we used what we call a purposive selection strategy. Okay, so we sought out people who we felt would be beneficial to our study, who we felt would bring a particular perspective and so on. So a purposive selection strategy was deployed to run a series of 5 focus groups. Okay, so we ran focus groups with young men aged between 19 to 30, young women aged between 19 to 30, 2 focus groups with parents, and groups with the elderly. And we ran both in South Hill and Balnacar West, and we also conducted 3 focus groups with the Gardaí, estate management personnel and community activists, and with local authority workers. We had 8 in-depth individual interviews, some with residents, and a number of key informants from various state agencies, the HSE, Limerick City Council and so on, and also from community organisations. I suppose the interviews followed the focus groups, and we wanted to use them to examine, to expand somewhat on issues that came up in the focus group, our focus group. So as a result of the sampling strategy, a total of 65 individuals participated in the research, which was quite a significant amount for what was, I suppose, really quite a small study. It was a pilot study. We used grounded theory as our method of qualitative data analysis. So, we use the process of reading through the transcripts over and over again and coding and, using that to build up or to look for emerging themes, emerging categories, and to build up the story of individual and group experiences in that way. So, if anybody has any questions about the methods, maybe, we can talk about it a little bit after, but we'll just push on with the interesting stuff, I suppose. So, I just got there faster. Okay, so basically, while it's common for right-wing commentators and politicians to focus in on bad parenting, and to use terms like problem families and problem children and so on as being the root cause of antisocial behaviour in working class areas, we were really quite surprised to hear it coming out from members of communities, of these communities who see it firsthand and who experience on, an everyday basis, the real challenges of living on the margins of society, okay, and living in extreme poverty and living in situations that are really very, very difficult. So I suppose the belief that community problems could be primarily traced to bad parents and to bad parenting, rather than to, massive and ingrained structures of inequality and inequity, these were really boldly expressed to us and really openly expressed to us by the elderly, by the middle-aged, and also by younger members of the communities, by teenagers, okay, by 18, 19-year-olds, okay? As well as, coming to us from, or being expressed to us by representatives of state agencies and community workers. And the strength of feeling about bad parents and bad parenting, and unfortunately about bad children, among residents went really far beyond the familiar and I suppose the well-established and well-understood desire of groups and individuals to kind of separate themselves out from what is seen as, the less respectable, and kind of Skeggs' classic, distinction between the respectable and the unrespectable working classes. And we would argue, that what it is instead is it's reflective of a deep and deepening commutative division that is arguably actively being cultivated by the media and by politicians. It's a divide and conquer, okay? So the division between the respectable and the deserving and those others, the kind of categorization of the bad others, came out really clearly to us from all residents. And this is an example of conversation that I had with elderly women, elderly ladies in South Hill, who described their neighbours. So they say, we were talking about how the community had changed over the years, and how they remembered it when they were younger and when they were bringing up their children and so on. And say, the best of the people moved out and the scumbags moved in, and that was it. And it's the same generation after generation after generation. It's the same families that are doing the trouble. I asked, are these families not, are they moved out by the council, are they moved on? And say, no, it's the decent people is moving out and they're taking over. So, there's a whole range of other issues, in and around here in terms of people who are able to buy their houses, years in the, what's that called again, the housing grant?
Surrender grant.
Yes, thank you, the surrender grant. People who were able to buy their houses, but who were then subsequently stuck. People who couldn't move out, who couldn't sell their houses, who couldn't get, who couldn't move on and so on. So the notion that the good people, the decent neighbours who could move, moved. And those who couldn't were stuck there while they felt their communities were collapsing around them. Okay? So this notion that bad parenting is increasingly being seen and being articulated as a personal choice on the part of the parents, rather again than as a result of structural inequalities, comes out really strongly. So we had, further conversations about parental discipline and parental awareness with key individuals, including, as we said, estate agents, city council officials and community workers. And the understanding is that many parents are opting out of disciplining or even knowing what their children are doing, and that this is happening out of laziness or out of choice. So this was a conversation we had with estate managers. They suggest, that parents would sooner have the kids out in the street than indoors annoying them. Basically, it's off you go, do what you like out there, but don't be doing it in here. And of course, where parents are understood as opting out of parenting, opting out of the hard work of parenting, of disciplining or educating their children, due to what is being presented to us as laziness or choice, they're also opting out of the opportunity to better themselves, to improve their lives, as a suggestion. Because then it can be argued that, again, they're to blame for their own circumstances. So any assistance that they're receiving can be legitimately questioned on behalf of those who are seen as being more deserving. So it's setting up a competition. Who is deserving, who is not deserving? And we know resources are getting scarcer and scarcer, so these kind of conversations become more common, okay? So any assistance that's being received can be legitimately questioned on behalf of those who are seen as more deserving. So these groups are seen as being disengaged from the community, being disengaged from work, as being either unable or unwilling to discipline and to educate their children. So they're being, publicly characterised as feckless, lazy, uncaring, spendthrift, spoiled by the state. And we saw this view coming through very strongly, bolstered by the pervasive understanding that they, them, these bad others, are getting too much. And this is an understanding that, we see being applied to different groups, to ethnic minority groups, to single parents, to the kind of catch-all category of the chav, okay? That they're always taking and never giving back is very regularly alluded to in the media and in the public sphere, to the extent that it has become, as Garner tells us, it's become normative. And this belief, again, was very clearly expressed by members of the two communities. And again, this was a conversation with the elderly ladies in South Hill. Says, they're giving them checks. They're saying their dole didn't come through. They're stoned out of their head. They're talking about being out partying all night, and they're coming out with more money. And this, notion that people are getting too much, this is echoed very much by estate managers who linked increases in social welfare to a rise in local problems and to a rise in the decline of the estates, which is a really interesting relationship to be making. And this comment, there were families in these estates who socially weren't ready, and the government started throwing money, upping the amount of social welfare, upping the amount of money that they could claim or they could get, and they just, of course, drugs went rampant because socially they weren't ready for it. So again, this all stems from the growing, public acceptance of the understanding that social welfare payments are bad for the poor. that giving people money is bad. It encourages only dependency, it encourages only fecklessness. And the majority of the residents that we spoke to were really strongly in favour of fining parents. And as a consequence of the understanding that there's not enough support, there's not enough money for all, and that some are more deserving than others, they were also very strongly in favour of reducing the money spent on providing services for teenagers in particular. So they felt that there is too much money being provided for teenagers, and very specifically within that, they felt that there's too much money provided for teenagers who have gotten in trouble. There's an awful lot of the groups and the youth groups and the activities and so on. An awful lot of the young people in them are referred through the Garda diversion programs and so on. So there's a feeling or an association that the bad children, the bad teenagers are getting all the help, and that there's nothing for the good kids or the good teenagers. So again, this need to fight over the allocation of support. It's about sowing division and sowing resentment, and also it distracts very much from questions about why such necessary resources are so limited. Why should people have to fight over them? Why should it be a toss-up between kids who've gotten in trouble, I wouldn't necessarily call them bad kids who have gotten in trouble, and kids who haven't gotten in trouble? Why should it be a fight between them as to who gets resources? And a key feature of neoliberalism, as we know, is the privatisation of public services, shifting public considerations of health, of education, welfare and housing, which are and which should remain essential, non-excludable and non-rival services. But a key feature of neoliberalism is shifting these public considerations to seeing users being excluded on the basis of cost or on the basis of competition. And that's really, really problematic. So, following this again, then I suppose that the surprising acceptance of fines and of rollbacks is acceptable then only when placed in this larger strategic context of carefully constructed, competitive categories of deserving and undeserving parents and children. So it's a very careful strategy, and one that is designed to shift attention away from cutbacks to a suggestion that this is proper use of resources. So I suppose I'll probably need to finish up. Basically, we're not seeking, I suppose, to diminish the real experiences of our participants, okay? People weren't just giving out about bad parents just because they felt like it. They weren't just complaining or moaning for the sake of it. Antisocial behaviour by children and by young people disproportionately affects working class communities, and it is a source of very real, very genuine distress for large numbers of people in the areas where this research was conducted and in many other areas around the country. But the most important question that needs to be asked is who is to blame or who is responsible for these experiences. What's being suggested to us is that it is the communities themselves. That it is the communities themselves, it is bad parents, it is out of control children, rather than what we really should be looking at, which are the policies of successive Irish governments that have entrenched and further ingrained this multi-generational inequalities. So in seeking answers to this question, we agree with Jones, who makes a really powerful assertion that governments have effectively socially engineered these working class communities to have the problems that they have. And further to this, and as I suppose we hopefully have seen a little bit today, the broad dissemination, the normalisation, and ultimately the internalisation of Levitas's very powerfully evocative moral underclass discourse that focuses on blame is consolidating and is adding to existing social problems. It's working to absolve the state of responsibility for the conditions in which marginalised communities are forced to live. And as a result of this, this apparent degree to which the discourse of parental blame has permeated as a result of this, the apparent degree to which the discourse of parental blame has permeated into popular consciousness and has encouraged people to blame one another for what's going on in their communities, this makes the possibility of enabling and encouraging people to focus on the impact of the larger social system itself even more difficult. So I suppose challenging the normalisation of this really divisive discourse of blame is of essential importance. Narratives that emphasise interdependence rather than individualism should be promoted, as should alternative representations of those living in poverty and those living on the margins. And such interventions can begin to undermine current popular understandings of the causes and the problems that are associated with poverty, with deprivation, and with marginalisation, so that they can then be properly reconfigured as structural inequalities. Any such shift, obviously, is very difficult to instigate, but intervention at the level of media representation, possibly, is one place to start. And working with communities to challenge media representation and public understandings is, I suppose, a first step in repositioning this discourse of blame and returning a critical focus to the role of the state and its ultimate responsibility for the creation, the maintenance, and the continuance of structural inequalities. So I'll stop there. Okay?